situation when it comes to global demographics. This is a sore point for Russia. This is a sore point for China. So we see very rapid reduction in the population. This is not a sore point for India. There is a growth in the population, but there are some forecasts earlier than the mid-century. The global population starts diminishing. It is all associated with the technological transformation, technological new wave. It is going on, and the process is quite vivid. Whether it is underpinned by the AI introduction or not, that's what we'll yet to see in the future, or our next generations will see that, but it's going to have its own footprint on the trajectory in global developments. At the same time, there are those who believe nothing is changing, and they give their own arguments. They do believe that following the statements or narratives, peace through power, rules instead of right, hegemony instead of pluralism, and saying words, I'm your boss today, you can have it the way it is. And it is very, very serious stance. And since this stance is voiced by the biggest global economy, you cannot put a blind eye on it. All these are the outlines of our discussion. We might speak at length about that. I'm afraid to take much of your time, and I cannot compete even with our distinguished speakers. So let's get off. Let's get it started. Your presentations, so up to 8 minutes. I'd like to reiterate, and then we'll see how it flows. Let's get it started. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the organizers for putting together this wonderful conference. So congratulations to IMEMO and, of course, to Professor Dinkin and my friend Fyodor for bringing together some of the best thinkers over the last many years to discuss issues that are most important and crucial to humankind. I like the way the moderator opened this conversation by saying that it's very difficult to predict anything, and yet he has asked us to try and look into the future and suggest some ideas on how the world might be. So let me first try and share with you 4 base conditions that I think are important to understand, and then possibly 4 worlds of the future that might all coexist, or at least 1 or 2 of them might dominate with greater vigor. So let me tell you the 4 conditions, base conditions. Besides the fact that we are in chaos and the old order has collapsed and there is a consensus that something new has to emerge. Let's assume that that's the reason why we are here. But let me tell you 4 drivers of the world of the future. The number 1 will be, in my view, commodities. And in that, food, water, and of course, key minerals will define a new architecture of connectivity, of infrastructure, of power, of conflict, and of course, of partnerships. In many ways, the materials and the commodities of the future will have some resemblance to the past, will have some new elements. For example, we will focus on parts of the periodic table we never paid attention to, and we are going to have to build, invest, and create solutions around that. But commodities of the future will define the architecture of the future and will create partnerships of the future. Now, of course, there is also something called climate change, and climate and food and water have a unique relationship amongst them. There will be parts of the world which will be unarable. There will be 140 million folks who will face climate-induced migration. There will be challenges on our borders. There will be migration questions. There will be resource scarcity questions. But my view, my positive take, that we are entering an era of abundance. We will be able to use technology to meet all the requirements of humankind. However, the distribution of the resources will be very political and will create new tensions. That's the first base condition, that commodities will shape the future of the world and it's not going to be equally and evenly distributed. The second, of course, is technology. AI is already bifurcating the world. We have a new export control ethic emerging around AI and technology. People are being shut out. There will be those who will compound their growth, and there will be those who will be permanently subordinate in this new technology architecture. Nuclear export control was kindergarten. What's going to happen in AI export control is going to be very brutal, and it's going to create the divides like never before. Technology is going to create an underclass. I mean, eventually technology is going to create an underclass where all humans are going to reside, but certainly in the short term, there will be certain countries who will do better than other countries, and they will define economic growth and progress in the future. And of course, I'm adding to this technology basket the existing question of nuclear proliferation and weapons of mass destruction, dual-use technologies, etc. That is going to be the second driver. The third, the moderator explained very eloquently, is demography. Demography is destiny. This continent is aging. Africa is going to add close to 800 million people to the workforce by the middle of the century. India is going to add another 200 to 250 million by that period again from its current already dominant young population. China is going to grow older before it can get richer. The Chinese growth is going to slow down, come crashing down to 1% in the next 5 to 7 years. And a new economic and political reality is going to emerge. And of course, in some sense, the power map of the world and the demographic map of the world are not going to be similar. So while you're going to have young populations in certain geographies, power will still remain concentrated in the much older geographies. So it's very interesting that as aspiring young population will demand agency, but that agency is going to be hard to come by because the old actors are going to still dominate the world. So it's a very interesting tension. And finally, and that's the most important for me, the big driver is identity. I think sovereignty is coming back in fashion. People are more aware of who they are, of their various identity markers, could be religion, could be culture, could be language, could be geography. But identity and sovereignty are going to be stronger in the next 20 years than they were in the last 20 years. And that's a big change. In the last 20 years, we were all becoming global. In the next 20 years, we will all become local. And I think that's a big change. Then in an interconnected world that relies on each other, we will be more local than we ever were in recent history. So those are the four drivers that I think will define the world of the future. Now let me give you very quickly in the next 3 minutes, 4 kinds of worlds that are possible. First world, I call it the long competition. Managed rivalry without any resolution. This is the long competition between China and the US, both very powerful countries, both not powerful enough to dominate. And that's a reality, that we will not have the dominance of the USA and USSR of the past ever again. There will be no real superpower in the next 25 to 30 years. I call them quasi-hegemons. They can destroy, but they can't build. They can't compel outcomes. They can't enforce decisions. So while they can destroy, they can't create and build the design for the future. So I call it a long competition without resolution. It's one future where you have these 2 big actors and then you have others around them who will manage the world together. That's the first one. The second, which I think is equally possible, is what I call the civilizational archipelago, where civilization states are going to create their own zones of governance and management. They are going to bind together with those who think like them, and they are going to create coalitions that will manage regions and sometimes trans-regional arrangements as well. So you are going to have, because of the strong identity that is emerging, you will have a resonance with this idea of a civilizational coexistence, where some of the old ways of partnership are going to proliferate alongside the new modern connectivity and infrastructure-induced relationship. The third is a slightly negative scenario, where what I call the great fragmentation. that the world is truly divided into, as my Russian friends would love, spheres of influence, where you have local powers managing their localities. There is very little global compact on climate, on technology, on commodities, on infrastructure, each for his own. This is the pure Darwin's world. It is the man-eat-man world, where literally you have the death of global governance for the next 25, 30 years. We are unable to build anything new or save what exists. And I think that's the great fragmentation. And my final, and I think this is possibly for me the real scenario in the middle of the century, I call it the pluralist compact, where we will have plurilateralism define the future, where we will have a web of plurilateral arrangements that will manage the world. There will be countries who will exist in more than one group, who will be the nodes and who will talk to each other and create order. But literally, you will have a Sinosphere, a Russosphere, Indo-Pacific zone of influence, the Indian Ocean and the South Asian subcontinent managed by certain actors. The African continent would possibly have 2 or 3 emergent actors working together. But we would have what I would call the non-Western pluralist compact, where the emerging and middle powers alongside the old powers will create a new web of joint ownership. It perhaps is already happening. We are seeing parts of these plurilateral groupings already emerge. Currently, they are regionally focused, but groups like the BRICS are transnational and are trans-regional. You will see, based on technology and commodities and infrastructure connectivity, many of these groupings crystallize and coexist together. So I cede back to the moderator. These are my predictions for the future.
Спасибо, господин Саран, за такой действительно
Thank you, Mr. Saran, for very dynamic forecast. Practically, you do not rule out any scenario. And in this respect, I have 2 questions to you. The first question. You didn't mention the possible scenario of unipolar world continuation in the future. Is it possible? Whether unipolar world stays with us for the future. And the second question, amid all these scenarios, which role do you assign to India? This is one of the biggest countries, the country which shows very high development pace, the country which over the last 25 years has covered a big gap when it comes to economic and social development. And Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister, has been very successful. Which role do you assign to India in all these scenarios? What scenario would India prefer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I am not ruling out any of the futures. In fact, I mentioned at the very beginning, I suspect all 4 of them will coexist. There will be a US-China rivalry which will be unmanaged. There will be a pluralist compact. There will be a fragmentation. And of course, you will have, in many ways, civilizational zones of influence that will continue. So I think what I am suggesting is that the world is going to be multi-layered and all of them are going to coexist together. On the unipolar moment, anyone who has followed what has happened in Iran should know that there is no unipolar world. The unipolar, if the biggest power in the world cannot open Hormuz Strait, I don't think that power should be recognized as being anything close to being powerful. That's the point I was trying to make, that today we are in a world of quasi-hegemons. The Americans can bomb a country to Stone Age, but they cannot create global governance that will serve 8 billion people. They don't have that ability anymore. That unipolar moment is gone. They can destroy, they cannot create, they cannot build, they cannot enforce, they cannot compel. So in my view, unipolar moment is behind us. That ended with the financial crisis in 2007-8. That was the end of the unipolar moment. We are, like you had mentioned now, either at the rock bottom of global governance or we're just taking baby steps to get out of it. The role of India is interesting. I think India inhabits at least 3 out of the 4 future scenarios. I mentioned that in the rivalry between US and China, there will be the balancing states, the others. I think the role of Russia and India is crucial there. I think we have done one thing very well, India and Russia. Even as we have pursued our own futures, we have remained the best of partners, and we have allowed each other to have the strength of having each other in our lives. Because Russia exists, I can negotiate a better world for myself. And because I exist, Russians can negotiate a better future for themselves. So I think an India-Russia compact is essential for the world. And India obviously will play a pivotal role in the pluralist compact, in the civilizational future, and of course, in a world where commodities and climate change and development challenges exist. If the Russians and the Americans were the military superpowers and the Chinese are the economic superpowers, India is the development superpower. We have lifted more people out of poverty, provided more food, provided more solutions to more people than anyone else in the world. We have that story to share with the world. That is our job in the world, to provide the development choices for those who seek it.
Спасибо огромное за этот блестящий.
Thank you so much for this very brilliant analysis, Peter.
To the moderator, to my co-panelists, and to the organizers. I think it is fair to say that the so-called US-led liberal order is in crisis and almost certainly receding from the stage. I agree that 2008 is the moment of rupture. It is the genesis of the anti-establishment political movements that have pervaded the entire West. This is not simply a story of receding power, but also a failure of historical narrative. There was a sense that history had an endpoint, that liberalism would extend to the ends of the earth. And after the end of the history, ended up becoming a prelude to something else and not an actual final point. It has become increasingly difficult to sustain this narrative. The difference between the world that claims to be universal and the actual world that exists beyond it is just too obvious now. So the question is what comes next, or what already exists as an actual and imagined alternative to this liberal universalism. And at least from where I sit in Washington and the people I see come there, the most commonly entertained alternative seems to be the nation state, a return to sovereignty within the bounds of an entity understood as the nation state. And this can be a return to the UN Charter, the UN order. That's what you often hear in the non-West. And then within the West, the anti-establishment parties have a more kind of conservative right-wing emphasis on national interest, restoration of national sovereignty as an alternative to liberal cosmopolitanism. And I think that this is wrong, that this is also a teleological historical narrative that assumes that over the last number of centuries, we have been taking steps towards subdividing a map from the North Pole to the South Pole into formally equal nation states. Now, this is the basic element, natural element of international politics. So I am a historian by training. Before I turn to the future, please allow me to kind of explain how this historical narrative came to be and why I think it sort of failed at every moment. So liberalism and nationalism in some ways are not alternatives. They derive from the same European intellectual tradition. Nations were immediately analogized to individuals, and international society was based on the kind of idea of liberal individual society. And you can say that the birth of modern liberalism and modern nationalism came with the French Revolution, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. And France, post-revolutionary France, exported the nation state to much of the rest of Europe, but it also immediately sought to become an empire. And so the genesis of the nation states allowed for France to gain power, both sort of in imaginative terms and in real terms, but that immediately led to a bid for empire. When this imperial French wave receded, nationalism in Europe was born. Germany became a nation state. Italy became a nation state. On the periphery of the Western world, The United States cohered, one can say, as a nation state following the Civil War, and Japan as well. All four of these newly emerged nation states immediately made a bid for empire. The US fought Spain and acquired its former colonies. Japan fought Russia. Germany and Italy pursued colonies in Africa. In World War I, brought about the sort of idea of self-determination. Wilson and Lenin both sought to sort of make this the rule of a new international order. But the republics founded by Lenin were immediately embedded in a new form of empire, and importantly, the nation states, the biggest ones in the rest of the world, immediately once again sought empire: Germany, Japan, Italy. They were defeated. The United Nations was supposed to be, again, a triumph of the nation state, which was inscribed as, again, the basic element of the international order. And decolonization further universalized this framework. But of course, we ended up, once again, with two massive empires within which these nation states were embedded. Each empire considered the other one the most evil and the only one in existence. From the Western perspective, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the final end of empire. The last empire was gone. Captive nations were free. Lithuania had become sovereign, and the world had finally been subdivided, as it always should have been, into nation states. Now we are at the crisis of what is clearly an American empire. The world was not just a liberal order of nation states, but a unipolar world, a liberal order led by the United States. So now that this empire is perhaps cracking, disappearing, there is, again, as I said at the beginning, a sense that perhaps this will be the final triumph of national sovereignty, the nation state. And I think, again, this is not going to be the case, that we are going to continue to live in a world of large entities that are different from the nation state qualitatively, not just great powers and middle powers, that it's a matter of degree or size, but of qualitatively different kind of organizing essence. So now I turn to the present and the future. What does this mean for us? One, I think this narrative of nation state doesn't mean that nation states never existed. And nation states, whether it was France, Germany, or Japan, were very good at mobilizing populations around an idea and scaling in a way that actually made them important geopolitical actors. France did not conquer all of Europe, but it came close. Same with Germany and so forth, Japan and Asia. Now that is no longer possible. The world is kind of bigger in many ways. And the two nations that sort of act as nations in the international system, Israel and Ukraine, are backed by the might of the Western Empire in different ways and have run into clear limits. They are not sort of the machines of power that Germany, Japan, France were in the past. Sort of in the other direction, nation states have been a disintegrating force, that large empires were disintegrating to smaller and smaller units, which are supposed to correspond more perfectly to some sort of identity. And I think we're at the end of that history as well. Quebec, separatism, Basque, Catalonia, and so forth, we don't see very much of this anymore. So this disaggregating logic, I think, has mostly come to an end. Scotland, for example, may actually gain independence, but not in order to be sovereign, but in order to join an even bigger union of the EU. And then the existing nation states that are still sort of recognizable as classic nation states, I think are all dying for three reasons. One is outward migration, so something like Latvia was supposed to have become finally a fully realized independent nation state, but the result is that it left one empire for another, and its population all left its country to go gain larger salaries elsewhere. It's already lost a third of its population. Then there is inward migration. The European Western countries have received so many people from outside that it's very hard to now think of France as being French and Sweden as being Swedish and so forth. And then there's the general trend of demographic decline. Korea, Japan, have neither substantial outward migration, certainly in the case of Japan North, substantial internal migration, but nonetheless, as kind of nation states, they seem to be doomed. So I think in this context, it is important to understand that the political bet on the nation state is misplaced, certainly in the West. That I think, and we can already see this, that in Europe, the politics of nationalism have already sort of met their limits, and that it would be wrong to imagine that with the receding of US power, US hegemony, the liberal order, that the EU will fall apart and France, Italy, Germany will emerge once again as sort of national entities. I don't think that that is possible. I think that the EU as it exists is not going to be sustained in the absence of American power. But we are not going to revert to some sort of national sovereignty. The same is true actually for America First. I think that that is the wrong mode for America to be operating in, that there is going to be some alternative to liberal order, but it is not going to be narrow nationalism. The United States is not going to become a normal country, as some have said in the past. There's no such thing. So then finally, I think that it is important to consider new categories. Civilization state is an interesting category. Nation states will continue to exist. There will be all sorts of different supranational arrangements that will be interesting and unlike one another. So I think as we consider the future, we should understand that we have come to the end of this long arc of liberalism, but also perhaps the end of this assumed teleology of the nation state, and that we should start thinking not just of small, medium, and large powers, but of entities of entirely different kinds. And that until we can have a mental map of the world that is not just corresponding to the UN General Assembly or the political map that we have drawn, we will fail to actually understand the real dynamics of power. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. You mentioned the French Revolution, the Great French Revolution, by the way. And sadly, for quite a while in the international affairs and the international life, neither brotherhood or equality or freedom are left, so they have gone. Every time the history turns upside down, and it turns upside down, well, very seriously. Really, the civilization states, and we attribute Russia to that category, naturally, and the countries which are less meant as civilization states, certainly they will continue to exist in future. But what rules they're going to follow? The international structures, the international mechanisms that are going to develop the rules of coexistence. What future is for those international mechanisms, and what would happen to the United States? The United States would still be a country. I would call that a young civilization state. But the United States, actually, how are they going to treat those international mechanisms like they're treating them now, or the United States would be urged to rely on some general regulation mechanisms in different areas?
Hard to predict what rules will emerge. I think Jennifer told us yesterday that there never have been any. I don't think that we will live in a world based on the idea of formally equal and universal nation states. I think, as I said, that never really corresponded to reality, and I think that it is very clear, increasingly clear, that the world will be organized again according to different principles in the future. And I think the best way to understand it is precisely to admit that diversity to ourselves, that there will be civilization states, there will be civilizations that encompass multiple states. There will be parts of the map that are formally states' territories, but in fact where no state exists. There will be groups of states that coalesce, as I said, in very different forms, because there was a sense for a while among Westerners that sort of the EU was the only way to integrate, or the United States of Europe. And I think there will be any number of interesting experiments and other forms of association. What will the US do? I think in domestic politics, America First is very powerful. Every candidate, even Democrats, will have to make the argument for how their foreign policy, how their politics answer to the interests and desires of the American citizen. But that does not mean the United States will operate as simply a country. It will remain an empire, hegemonic power. The question is, what goals will it pursue? And I think it will no longer be liberal universalism, and on what scale. Right now, there are adventurous excursions, as Trump called them, in the Middle East, which look a lot like what we saw 20 years ago. But I think that is the last gasp, I hope, of a certain form of American politics. And I do think that the United States probably will exercise its power in different regions and in different ways, and will not necessarily become weaker as a result. If it seeks to actually match its power to its potential, it may gain strength, relatively speaking, in the international system. That's certainly my hope, is that we stop wasting all the extraordinary assets we have, pursuing absolutely unachievable ends in every corner of the globe.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. Richard, over to you.
I just comment on what Peter's just said. Yesterday was the 10th anniversary of the Brexit vote, so I'll have to tell the 7th Prime Minister in 10 years that the nation state and taking back power was actually a foolish enterprise. Maybe it was, but nevertheless, it's 10 years of thinking about how to regain sovereignty and how to rebuild a nation state is an interesting question. But
The EU for the US, that was part of the idea.
that was, but it's found itself in the middle of the Atlantic without one or the other. So anyway, I wanted to make 5 points this morning. The first one is on methodology. I know that everybody loves methodology, so but I will try to limit myself. I want to pick up on what Alexander Lemanov said in the opening session the day before yesterday in the evening, in which he outlined the way that China sees the world, how the Russo-Chinese alignment also sees the world. And I think it's extremely important because the way we try to understand and analyze things shapes our thinking in all sorts of ways. The methodology which dominates is a sort of the Anglo-American political science, power. The classic example is Joseph Nye's idea of soft power, which when I first heard of it many years ago, I was absolutely shocked because what it basically does is instrumentalizes what we used to call cultural diplomacy, humanitarian links, and all the rest, and it makes it simply a power play, simply a reduction to a way in which you maximize your own dominance. And it was a hegemonic way of thinking about things. An alternative approach is the one which I'll outline in a minute, is the English school, not out of patriotism or inspired by Brexit, but the English school has had a long tradition of an alternative way of thinking, and it goes back to Hedley Bull, Martin White, and even in a different way, Michael Oakeshott in the terms of rationality, in the way we see the world. So it's not just about power, it's actually the way in which you could sort of provide a different framework to, the English school thinks of an ontology, a distinct methodology based on a view of the world that presented, which refuses to accept a view of the world which is presented as universal, but in fact is deeply parochial. This is the Anglo-American way of looking at things. And it's a reflection of the purported hegemony of certain ways. So that's just an outline. And on that, I'll build my second point. What does this model, the English school way of looking at the world, give us? And the first thing it would give us is that we need to distinguish between the international system under which we live today and models of world order that contend within that international system. So the international system that we live under today is the Charter International System, as I call it, the United Nations-based system established in 1945. I know that in Russia people like to call it the Yalta-Potsdam system. Yalta-Potsdam was not a system. It was a particular arrangement of power. But it contributed, and the Soviet Union, of course, and China, and even India contributed enormously to the establishment of this 1945 system. And this charter system is very different from the League of Nations system, which actually tried to perpetuate empire. And it was incorporated as Jan Smuts from the leader of South Africa. So this international system we live under today, the 1945 Charter system, UN-based, and all of the international laws, norms of behavior, and so on, developed within its framework over the last 85 years, is the one we live under. And it's built on the mistakes and learning from the earlier international systems, the Versailles system, the Vienna system before that, Utrecht system, and all the way back to Westphalia, the nation state, which of course is a very foundational element. So we have the international system, and we have models of world order within it. Of course, this is something that Henry Kissinger fundamentally failed to do in his well-known book on world order. He failed to distinguish between the system and world order. In other words, brilliant analysis though it was all at that level, as I suggested in that first point, and methodology simply about power, balance, and so on. Its language itself reflected a certain bankruptcy of intellectual imagination of how we can see and understand world affairs. So, so, as I say, the international system today is the Charter international system. Of course, it's got many failings, but it's a combination of great power comity, that's the permanent members in the Security Council, but also, if you like, democratic or federative comity in the General Assembly. Again, we know all about the failings about the United Nations, but it's the only international system that we have today. There are no alternative orders or ideas even of world order waiting in the wings. There's all sorts of technological and other developments and challenges facing humanity, climate change today. In the United Kingdom, we're beating all records for heat, maybe up to 40 degrees centigrade. All these things exist, but it's only within the framework of this Charter international system where states can come together to solve these issues. The ideology or the idea at the heart of the Charter system is sovereign internationalism. So it's not like Eikenberry and so many other American scholars argue, simply a reversion to sovereignty. It's Westphalia plus. It's sovereignty, the nation state as the main actor and source of sovereignty, democracy, developmental ideas, identity, all of that, combined with a commitment to internationalism, multilateral organizations working together. So that is the ideology of that. So that's the international system. My third point is at the level of international politics, as I say, we have contending models of world order. From 1945, we had two main ones, the Soviet system, with its model of socialist internationalism and its whole developmental and civilizational complex associated with it. Still has huge legacy, not just within the Northern Eurasia, post-Soviet space, but even wider in Africa you go, still just come back from Tanzania. Those ideas still resonate in all sorts of ways, but that's something. The other model of world order, of course, is the US-led model of world order. What do we call it? Yesterday, it was mentioned several times, the notion of a collective West. It's an important term. I still think it lacks specificity. I call this system, the alternative model of world order, the political West. Why the political West? Because it was created. It wasn't naturally given. It's a particular order emerging out of the historical context of 1945 and then the growing Cold War with the other model, the Soviet Union. And this political West has deeply affected the state development of its members, all except one to some degree, and that is the United States. Even though it created a model of world order, it also kept itself relatively independent of it. Of course, much to the disappointment of the European part of it. In the first years, this was, the focus was very much until 1989, the end of the first Cold War, the US-led political West had a model of liberal internationalism, called liberal institutionalism, call it what you will. It had two facets, of course, the imperial facet, which was a hegemonic, endless interventions, Mossadegh overthrown in Iran in 1953, etc., in Guatemala. The list is enormous, 35 major interventions, coups, and so on, led by the imperial facet of the political West. The other side was the Commonwealth side. It did deliver genuine public goods, freedom. It delivered free trade. It delivered all sorts of enormous model of public goods within that framework. After 1989, this political West changed. it moved away from liberal internationalism to liberal globalism. Globalism is something totally different. It's not internationalism. It's assumption, it's a hegemonic strategy of dominance, it's of leadership. I mean, I don't buy into the whole notion of a unipolar world at all. It never was. There was just this model of world order claimed to be universal. Of course, it was not. And Russia, China, India, so many other countries, and if my model of the international system, the charter system, has any meaning, 193 sovereign states certainly would never have accepted unipolar. Yes, it was dominant. It claimed its dominance, and it was enormously powerful. It radicalized. After 1989, the enormity of the change, I don't think we've understood entirely. I have no time to go into it. I'll just list the 6 major changes that happened to our political West, this collective West. The first one is the Hegelian one. That is nonsense about the end of history, Fukuyama, Koyev, and all of that Hegelian stuff. The second radicalization was Kantian, the extraordinary dominance of human rights, and human rights as an ideology, not a substance. We're all in favor of human rights, of course, but as an ideology, an instrumentalization, it went into overdrive. The third element was Hobbesian, military power, discussion of endless interventions, which of course all failed, in all sorts of ways. The fourth radicalization was the Hayekian, neoliberalism turbocharged the ideology of globalization. Again, a facet of this globalism. Globalization existed at technical level, but I'm talking about the ideology. The fifth radicalization was the Straussian, Leo Strauss. And now Leo Strauss has affected the neoconservatives in the United States and so on. And we all know that the Straussians do not engage in dialogue. They do not engage in diplomacy because they actually, in their vision of esoteric knowledge, know what happened and know what Plato meant 2,000 years ago. And anybody who disagrees with them is actually not only mistaken, but fundamentally evil. This is the Straussian approach to politics. And of course, the sixth one is the Marcusian, the increasing evidence on identity politics and so on. So all of this was going on. The political West changed dramatically. And today it is disaggregating, not collapsing, it's disaggregating. The component parts are beginning to move more independently. They moved more independently before 1989, the Gaullist vision of pan-continentalism versus Atlanticism has a long tradition. But today, under Trump, this model of US is defecting from its model of world order that it created in 4 ways. It's leaving the political West, its own model, and of course the Munich security speech and last year's speeches reflect that. The second defection under Trumpian US is from the international system. We saw earlier this year the United States left 66 international organizations, half of them UN-based. This is it's defecting not only from its model of world order, it's defecting from the very international system that it helped establish in 1945. A huge effect. The third defection internally, which I don't want to go into, is it's defecting from the US Constitution in all sorts of ways. And the fourth one is it's, as Steve Bannon would say, it's dismantling, disaggregating the American state, deconstructing the so-called deep state. At the same time, we have a nascent alternative model of world order emerging. I don't know what to call it. Let's call it the political East. This is Russo-Chinese alignment at its core with India, BRICS, SOS, and so on, with not just a alternative power system, it actually methodologically challenges. It's not just simply a counter-hegemonic alignment, it is an anti-hegemonic alignment. That is, it's against the whole principle of hegemony. We heard that from the speech from Alexander Lemanov on Monday evening. So it's a fundamentally different model and vision of politics, which actually is much more similar and aligned with English school thinking, interestingly enough. So it's not counter-hegemonic, but anti-hegemonic. It's not revisionist in terms of the international system, but it is revisionist in terms of challenging the balance at the level of international politics. It's an alternative model of world order. Neutrality, non-alignment, all of that is part of it. Neutrality, of course, is not allowed by the political West. As Dmitry Firtash used to say in Ukraine, why do we have to choose? And the Georgians from Tbilisi today, saying, why do we have to choose?
Ричард, я попрошу вас не забывать.
Richard, please don't forget about timing.
Conclusion. We need to think about international politics differently. States remain central. There is no alternative model of international order, international system than the United Nations. Hopefully, we won't have a war in which a new system will begin to emerge, because new systems emerge after wars. There will be, a war, a global third world war, of course, will be the last war in which there'll be no international system, no models of world order whatsoever. So, but we have this non-hegemonic visions of world order emerging. And that, in other words, our vision of how world order would look like in the middle of the 21st century is to make the existing system work better rather than try to invent a new one. Thank you.
Спасибо, Ли.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's, we need to define the problems and processes. It's very important. Try to make any forecast. As what you have said, I would like to ask the following questions. The first one, a collective West. That's what we call it. We call it collective West. Do you believe that in next 25 years, what is the destiny, what is the fate for the collective West, as economic growth are lagging behind those of the global South? Demographics is in a worse shape compared with the demographics of this South, global South, and all the economic indicators are showing stagnation for next decade. Will it lead to the situation that the collective West will lose its role in international politics and in world order, and it will be replaced by other regions, global South, that's what we call it? And will collective West exist at all? From Moscow angle, we see that there are some fractures already in collective West, and it is not quite clear how big these fractures can be.
The political West is disaggregating. The US part of it is separating from the European part of it. It won't happen immediately. There's enormous commitment on both sides to Atlanticism, to this continuing Atlantic power system. But the Atlantic power system has lasted, it's unique. Never before in world history there has an alliance like this lasted for over 80 years since 1945 and its establishment. And it's a unique political phenomenon, hence I want to give it specificity by calling it the political West, as distinguished from other Wests, by the way, which you could say the 500 years of the colonial West, the imperial West, which is also coming up to its crisis, and of course the philosophical West going back to Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian stuff. Can a better West emerge? No. We do have internally in the society all sorts of changes. I'd also, to answer your question, the fate of the United States is a rather separate issue. The power and the inventiveness of the United States' ability to reinvent itself should not be underestimated, but a new type of United States will emerge, and I think Peter indicated some of those elements emerge. Europe, unfortunately, Western Europe is fated to what you say, marginalization, stagnation. It's at the moment, it's very much involved in totally intellectually sterile things. We can see it in the quality of Western leadership today. I won't name names, but I think you know whom I mean. And the European Union itself is, how can I put it? It's suffering an internal power grab by the European Commission. And there's all sorts of tensions within the European Union in this power grab and an attempt to transform it. As John Monnet said, European Union will always develop through crises, but this crisis facing now is so enormous that the Ursula von der Leyen Commission talks about geopolitical EU. Of course, what she means, we don't know, but we do know it means that she wants more power. So, unfortunately, the fate of Western Europe, again, I certainly don't welcome this as a West European myself, but I'd like to, at the moment, there's very few ideas, and even the fact that we have this endless governmental crisis, a crisis of governance in the United Kingdom, is a reflection that we simply don't know how to revive and give a new vision of the future, and and how to revive, if you like, social democracy after the neoliberal excesses of the last 40 years. So it's tough. And of course, as it goes down, it becomes more dangerous and more violent to its neighbors and towards China, towards Russia, towards everyone else. So that's the crisis, and that's, I think, what we need to study, is the internal tensions within the West European part of the political West. Thanks.
Значит, еще один вопрос.
Another question, if you allow. In 25 years, will we see identity in military sector in Europe, regardless, independent of the United States? For Russians, it is very important because this identity will be based on enemy relations to our country, and these enemy-based relations and adversary relations will just strengthen this internal strife.
Now, of course, of a European NATO, a European treaty organization, all of this led in particular by Poland and the United Kingdom. Even today, the E5 is meeting this with France, Germany, UK, Poland, Italy. And of course, the E3, yes, it's going in that direction. The political West, the collective West, the United States goes its own way, does its own thing. Western Europe consolidates, not on the basis of a positive developmental vision, but precisely on militarism, military Keynesianism, and hostility to Russia.
Спасибо.
Thank you so much. Sergey, over to you. Thank you. Need to say that the mid of the 21st century is not that long future. It's closer than 2000, actually. So the decisions which are made today, the programs which are being implemented within this decade, are shaping and will shape the image of the world economy, of the international security order. The humanity will be living in the mid-century. Some figures can be given. According to the UN statistics, the population will be 9.5 billion, 7 billion will be living in emerging countries if we do not count China. Out of this 7 billion, 1.5 will be living in poor countries. Energy transition will go on. And the traditional statement of those who support energy transition, that is very important for the environmental protection, is associated with the fact that the fossil fuels is the source of macroeconomic instability. The Strait of Hormuz crisis demonstrates and probably will become one of the impetus for further introduction of renewable energy. This will be supported by industry-based and industrial policies of some countries in the United States, in the European Union. They prioritize development of microelectronics, development of renewable energy storage facilities, batteries particularly, and the associated industries will be using and scaling up these products in their output. The same programs are pursued by China in the Chinese 15 years development. China singles out and prioritizes major competitive edges in industry. This is AI, microelectronics, solar panels, batteries, and e-cars, which have been demonstrating growth in China is leading on this market. So the investment in science in these countries is tangible. If we look not at the structure as a part of the GDP, but ratio and share in global investment in science, both by private companies and state. The United States accounts for 35%, the EU 15% of global total spendings, and China is around 17% in science. So totally it is 66% of the global investment for science, if we're talking about the transatlantic bloc. So this is 49%. This is huge. This is a huge number. Number of economists, the Council of Economic Consultants at the President of the United States saying that we might face a big divergence The first divergence was the first industrial revolution, steam engine, which led to the situation that the economic growth around the world differentiated. Most developed countries started to develop faster. And AI may become the source of this big divergence. And those countries which can not only use but develop AI, will use these technologies, will be at the forefront of this movement. Now we see already the segregation. 49% of developed countries use 49% of AI capacities. The emerging countries account for 50% and 1% for the poor countries. But of course, there are some preconditions. This is the access to electricity power, to data centers, to the internet, and the literacy level and the capability to work with modern devices. So correspondingly, AI will determine the labor market. The International Labour Organization believes that by the mid-century, up to 60% of all the jobs in developed countries will be transformed. It relates not to monotonous manual work, but it relates to cognitive occupations which require a high level of education. Those who are able to adapt the education system to these changes will get additional competitive advantage. So that's where we see new features of the shapes of superpowers. So this is the technologies and the capability to produce these technologies using your own territory and your manufacturing capacity, and those who can want to try to get these technologies, at least to use these technologies, because this circuit breaker system and effect will be more stringent and will be more popular. Maybe we'll have the participation in global economy, participation in global industry by subscription. If you fulfill some political elements or criteria, then you can get access to these new technologies. So based on what I have said, we can forecast that we are moving to new bipolarity. This is the United States and China with the European bloc. We will not see bipolarity in its conventional mode, which existed in the Cold War time. Why? First, China has been building international institutions. China doesn't participate in any military alliances and is unlikely to be interested in creating alternative institutions like the Council of Economic Aid during Soviet time or the Warsaw Pact agreement. So it is not striving for reproducing or creating a new alternative to integration model. At the same time, the West continues its own internal consolidation. So this feature, from my standpoint, is a strategic phenomenon of European culture, of the American culture after the European culture, byproduct of the European culture. So the research for consolidation allies, this alliance-based perception is quite clear. So probably the other parties should create these blocks and alliances. It will be easier to work with. But the other country doesn't create that, and the West starts consolidating internally. So we see the different standards, both technological and how they do business in the regulations. Probably they will see some duplicating institutes. So we'll see the development one single block, which look like the West and the rest, with China as an important player.
As I said, 7 billion people in the developing nations by the middle of the 21st century means that these people are not going to live in the West, and 1.7 billion people are going to live in India. And the politics of the third parties, India, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa, and whether they can establish relations with the West and with China, becoming just a bridge for transfer of knowledge, technologies, etc. That would determine whether we have a polycentric system in a viable way. We would get actually multipolarity with one block ahead. The propensity for conflicts in the world and the scientific and industrial development needs would strengthen the state. So it doesn't mean that the state would keep everything under check, but at the same time, the cost of prices goes up, and some adventurous actions may act as a brake and would hurdle the development and would somehow hinder the ambitious goals. So building an automobile plant today is totally different from what used to be 100 years ago. It would require not just resources, but it would require international stability and international cooperation. Look at the Strait of Hormuz, according to Peterson Institution. It may result in the fact that the United States may lose up to 1% of its GDP, and China would lose 2%, and South Korea would lose about 3% of its economic growth. So it means that the cost of mistakes goes up. And apart from the technologies, that's very important that the strategic planning and public governance has to reach a totally new level amid such conditions and not replicating the 20th century. So the experience of the 20th century has to be revisited and analyzed. And by the middle of the 21st century, we'll see the contention between the global governance models and the schools of that governance. So there would be contention of 2 or 3 new systems. This is what awaits us in future. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sergey. Sergey, thank you. Yeah, really, technologies are going to develop, and somehow they are going to impact our everyday life. But I think that anyway, the renewables will not somehow underpin the growth of technologies, and well, new technologies would require new generation, and such power generation could be provided only by traditional fossil fuels 20 years from now and 50 years from now. That is inevitable. Technologies are developed by corporations, with or without the public money. In your opinion, in the middle of the 21st century, will the corporations be able to dilute the sovereignty? That's a very good question. I do think that the situation would be the same in essence, just like the one we're living in, and probably that's normal for the human societies in general. The corporations want more freedom, but still they are deployed on the territories of sovereign states, and most likely the sovereign states would not disappear. On the contrary, the public regulation may become more stringent, and what the corporations may do for the global development, they can facilitate the harmonization of the public regulation, or at least actually they may try to strip them of some ideological pillars. Corporations may facilitate the rules of engagement, so to say. So I noticed the following tendency: everyone who is involved in security. So we say that the world order is collapsing, and that we're living in the world without rules, but the people who are involved in security and business area say that there should be rules. We need at least some rules in order to do some transactions. And a lot would depend on the corporate sector. A lot would depend on the international cooperation with the companies amid such intergovernmental polarization, so to say. Thank you. Thank you. I have a common question to follow up what's been said already. That's a question about the global security system, how it would look like in the middle of the 21st century. In what way it goes now. So the global security system has been eroded, and there is nothing left but the nuclear deterrence. This is something that prevents us from a global war. It doesn't guarantee us from regional conflicts, and the number of such conflicts is going up, but the technologies are developing the way that new types of warfare, conventional ones, non-nuclear ones, would emerge. But in terms of the destruction capacity, they actually could match the one of the nuclear weapons. So what the international security system would rely on in the middle of the 21st century, would it be in better condition, shape, or worse shape? Bear in mind that today we have no leverage that would help us to agree on something. We cannot even agree, and frankly speaking, we cannot even agree on the reform of the United Nations Security Council. We don't have such an opportunity. Any comments on that? Yes, over to you.
Look, it's a very big question. And I think it's a conference theme. We need many sessions, many panels to try and respond to it. But let me tell you a few trend lines. Number one, clearly the peace and security pillar of the UN Security Council is now defunct. It was, in some sense, ironic that the UN Security Council could not agree to a statement during the Russia-Ukraine face-off, if you go back to 2022-23. In fact, the G20 was able to come out with a statement, but the UN Security Council was not. And all the members of the UN Security Council are members of the G20. It's very interesting that I think there is something wrong with that institution itself, because the people in different rooms can produce outcome, but in the Security Council, they're not able to agree. It's very interesting. So I think one of the trends is that if the Security Council is going to remain paralyzed, are we going to see some extra institutions come up on the side? So for example, Donald Trump tried to create a board of peace. Now we can laugh at it, we can dismiss it, but maybe there is a trend line here that certain countries are going to partner and build institutions outside of the Security Council to secure certain specific regions, conflicts, tensions. So that is one trend line. Number two, the privatization of conflict. The private sector is going to, due to the asymmetrical means deployed today, drones and rocket launches and outer space satellite capabilities, you are going to see a large participation of the private sector, which is going to allow, in many ways, the proliferation of destructive capabilities to a large number of actors outside of the traditional club. So in some sense, you're going to see security becoming more complex because capabilities are going to become more secular and more democratic in many more hands. And number three, look, the threshold below the nuclear conflict has become much bigger. So while nuclear prevents a big war, multiple small wars are happening already below the nuclear threshold. And I think the escalatory ladder has become longer and taller. So you have a greater area of conflict happening today. Many countries have been able to secure certain conventional spaces to carry out certain actions without worrying about the escalation to the nuclear threshold. So I think the nuclear umbrella exists, but the umbrella is much higher and much wider, which is leading to a more conflictual world, a more contested world.
Thank you. Кто-то еще хочет из участников сказать пару слов?
Anyone wants to comment on that? Yes, please, Richard.
Indicating the changing character of war. We've just seen in what we could call the Third Gulf War, the West Asia War, that Iran has managed to withstand the mighty power of the United States. It's had to keep its battle fleet 1,000 kilometers away from the Persian Gulf. And in fact, you could say aircraft carriers, even tanks and so on, have become boutique weapons in the new arrangements. In other words, this is, I mean, in addition to the normative multipolarity I mentioned of 193 sovereign states, none of which wants to give up its sovereignty, with a huge bulge of middle powers exercising things. So we're seeing, in a sense, a democratization of international politics, not in a positive sense, but the sort of the diffusion of power. And so the US mighty $1.5 trillion budget, defense budget, if it happens for next year, it becomes almost meaningless, especially with other new technologies. The second thing is, on the United Nations, I go back to this, that the political West since 1945 has always effectively tried to substitute for this model of world order, to substitute for the international system, for the United Nations. It couldn't do it as long as the Soviet Union existed, with its allies in China and other places. After 1989, with the development of the so-called rules-based order, the liberal international order, all of that, these are words saying we are the universal as opposed to the United Nations. This is what we're now seeing is the need for Russia, for China, to recommit to the United Nations. It's very hard. We know, and we have no illusions about the way it works. It's absolutely, and obviously India, Brazil, some other states need to become members. And in fact, maybe this crisis now may provide that shock. We've talked about UN reform for 25 years. Yes, the development of alternative bodies, BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Mercosur, all the other bodies are important, but they ultimately cannot substitute for the system. So the order cannot substitute for the system in English school thinking. So it's good. But your first point about nuclear deterrence has lost the power to deter. So as we know, there's a big discussion today how to restore the deterrence power of nuclear weapons. Some advocate a salutary shock somewhere or other. And that was to shock the world back into this fear of nuclear war. Well, that's where the debate is today. I would argue strongly not to rise to the provocations because that way, in other words, we are in a slow-motion Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's a very slow-motion one, but fortunately, the Cuban-Karibsky crisis in 1962 was solved through negotiation. That's the only way to go today, through strategic patience. Thank you.
I wanted to argue with Richard in response to your original question, but first I'd like to say that I agree with what you finished with, that I also hope that there will be no shock that ends this conversation definitively. You're right that there has been a democratization of military power now, that the extremely expensive technologically advanced weapon systems are being overwhelmed by much cheaper alternatives. But I do not think that that necessarily is the trend line going forward. I am not a technologist. There are others who know this stuff much better, but it seems likely that by the middle of the 20th century, the technological superpowers will have made advances in AI and other areas that will reestablish their predominance. So the current sort of drone revolution in which Houthis can play an outsized role in international politics might be eclipsed by a future in which certain powers have the ability to press a button and change the entire state of affairs. But I won't begin to describe exactly what that world will look like.
Спасибо, Петр. И все же ядерное сдерживание.
Thank you, Piotr. But still, nuclear deterrence works. Here I want to say that we understand that clearly in the Russian Federation. And today, this is the cornerstone of the international security. So over to you, Sergei. I wanted to add to what my colleagues have said in terms of the institutions and their role. I do think that step by step we are moving to the gray zone. So those institutions do exist and they were created a while ago, and they no longer meet the demands of the time. They have to change, they have to adapt. What happens? People start bypassing, circumventing those institutions. So Donald Trump not only created that board of peace, but also the same goes on in trade. So the countries try to synchronize their actions without committing themselves to anything. So as long as we do not approach a new system, as long as those bonds are not created, we will remain in the gray zone. The institutions would be existing just in order to explain what is going on. For instance, the United Nations does a lot of very useful job, but still the international cooperation would tend to circumvent the existing multilateral institutions. Thank you. Thank you. BRICS. So do you think that in the middle of the century, BRICS nations would be capable of assuming a bigger role in the international governance and the international participation in the economy and in security? So there are two BRICS countries present among the panelists, and two other countries. One is not a big fan of that association. to put that modestly. Well, the UK has never given any positive assessment regarding BRICS. So what can you say about BRICS in the middle of the 21st century? Over to you.
Yes, BRICS nations will play a bigger role in the middle of the century, undoubtedly. The question is, will they play a bigger role as BRICS or as individual contributors to world affairs? So I think undeniably, there are countries within the BRICS coalition today who are individually already contributing a lot to global order, to economic growth, to trade and connectivity projects, to even stability, peace, and development aspects. So the BRICS countries are undoubtedly going to, in many ways, be the harbingers of the new world that is emerging in the next 20 years. That's a given. I think the question for us is that as BRICS, as the BRIC countries emerge and become more influential, will the ethic that led to the creation of this group still exist, or are they going to become like the group they are replacing? I think that's the big question. I always ask the BRICS group that we, in 2007-8 in Moscow, when we met before going to Yekaterinburg in 2009, when we were planning the design of BRICS, and I was a very young boy who was coming and attending those meetings at that time. The feeling was that the system was unfair, that it was unipolar world, it was hegemonic, and we needed to find a way of balancing the excesses of the Western architecture. My question is that will we do the same if some other hegemonic emerges from within the BRICS? Will the BRICS resist hegemony from within the BRICS? Will we seek justice and will we seek balance when one of us becomes very similar to the country we were trying to respond to in 2007-8? And the jury is still out there. So I think BRICS are going to be influential, but I hope the BRICS grouping remains inclusive, remains more democratic in international affairs, and continues to oppose hegemonic impulses.
Да, Сергей, пожалуйста.
Да, спасибо. Ну вот.
Well, to follow up what I've said right now, I do think that BRICS is an anti-bloc in a positive sense, because there are no institutions, there are no councils, there is no red tape. So this is actually a coordination tool that do not want the world to be split into blocks. So the BRICS, this is the international interaction mechanism for the middle of the 21st century, because there are now 5-year-long plans for development. There is no national economy, anything like that. So this is closer to the notion of a club. And probably, thanks God, that this looks more like a club. Piotr?
Subtle Indian digs at China are always entertaining. Yeah, BRICS is a counter-hegemonic project, and I don't believe that it could become what it opposes because it is an incoherent coalition, again, beyond the counter-hegemonic elements, in that there's no way that a new order economic system can be built without including the United States in this operation. Perhaps Europe is in terminal decline, but I do think that the US, given its technological and economic significance, is going to have to enter the equation in the future, perhaps in some radically new form.
As a slight joke, I had told a colleague of mine from the US that we want to include you in the BRICS, but it will be wrong English. BRICS cannot be a BRICS because there is S at the end of it. So it will be difficult to add you to the group. But you're right, in some sense, when I was talking about the BRICS becoming more inclusive, I think BRICS is a system of international cooperation. It is not a bloc. All of us individually inhabit different groups, which are our natural groups. You have your region, we have our region, we have our certain key countries who support our growth, development, security questions. But because I think BRICS is the coordination body. BRICS has to think of itself as the coordinating arrangement where different parts of BRICS inhabit different parts of the world. And we are the pluralist compact, the one I was talking about, the future where a web of arrangements coexist because there are certain countries who can talk to each other across those arrangements. I think BRICS is the coordinating body rather than a alliance or a compact of the traditional sense.
Да, здесь я хочу полностью.
I want to totally agree with you. Richard, you wanted to add something, right?
Much what was just being said, because it's BRICS is not a bloc. It is a framework for analysis. It's not counter-hegemonic either, just doing hegemony from the other side. It is anti-hegemonic. And it provides a fantastic opportunity. Already we see China and India working together by meeting in the summits and so on. So it's very important. But the future of BRICS, there's a big major paper being published by the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, which describes the various options for development. And I think their conclusion was that it needs greater institutionalization, some sort of secretariat, not to replicate other bodies, but in its own way. But it's already providing a way with the new development bank, the CRA, the Credit Reserve Facility, and others. And so I think that, clearly at the moment, given the West Asia war, where two BRICS members are effectively fighting each other, so it's clearly facing major challenges. But yet, so I think it's an important organisation and it needs some institutional development to maintain its role in world affairs, including de-dollarization. It won't happen immediately, but already there's talk of digital currencies and so on. So it will play an important part in the next few decades.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much. Talking about de-dollarization, I want to reiterate, this is a mistaken perception that BRICS is considering and elaborating plans on creating any alternative currency. BRICS has some countries which are deprived of the right or with limited right to use the reserve currency. Therefore, there is a process of bigger share of settlements in national currencies, which is very important. We have less than 5 minutes, and at the end of our session, we wanted to give the opportunity to the audience to ask questions. Please, let's do it right now. Mic to the audience, please. Mr. Peskov and dear panelists, I would like to congratulate you on one of the most interesting panel discussions at Primakov Readings. I was hooked by the point of view by Richard that we see the bankruptcy of the political idea. Probably that's what is happening. One of the panelists said yesterday that today it has become very popular. Aristotle, with his famous Thucydides mistake, two of the panelists, Samir and Peter, were talking about civilizations. So this is a step to modern development, kind of following Huntington, but with modern variations. I would like to share two observations. First, at all the previous systems, what Richard has talked, starting with Westphal, were shaped in Europe. It is not going to be the case. Europe will not be source of wars or the kitchen of shaping new world orders. At least it should be Eurasia with American participation. And the second observation, which I cannot but share with you, yesterday I listened to the 45th and 47th president address, who said how he was happy to trade in Venezuelan oil, which offsets costs for Caracas operations. And I got an idea, strange idea. Person sounds like a president of Petra state. That's what we call petrol state or oil state. The United States is the biggest oil exporter right now, crude oil. If the United States is an oil state and China is e-state, that's what Sergei has mentioned, green, solar energy, e-cars. That's about the bankruptcies of political school of thought. Thank you. Thank you for this remark, for this comment. Would like to have, of course, would like to have this deep and calm nature when it comes to British and Russian differences. not like today, not by our will, but these differences are more aggressive and not constructive at all. Do we get any questions? Please, over here. Andrei Kazinets, the Far East Federal University. I would like to thank all the speakers. I have a question which is ideological narrative itself, but might be an alternative scenario model which we haven't touched upon today. If we remember the beginning of the 20th century, so we saw the development of global economy, we saw new industrial centers, we saw new tycoons like Rockefellers, and a person in the street just was deprived of the results of the work. Today we see the first trillion owner, new technologies, new digital economy emergence, and human is deprived of his voice, face, AI is replacing human. So we have kind of imperialism 2.0, technological imperialism. Can we believe that one of the possible scenarios is another imperial race, a new spiral of this imperial race? And if yes, what can be done by global majority not to become the object in this imperial race, but to stop this and to advance further? Thank you.
This question in my opening remarks, where I said that technology is likely to create a new underclass, and that underclass could be individuals, but it could also be nation states. In fact, I said that technology is going to create permanent subordinate nation states. And I think you mentioned that I can't predict the future of tech, but I can certainly predict that technology will concentrate power more dramatically than we witnessed in the last century. Concentration of power in the next 25 to 30 years with individuals and with countries is going to be more profound than in the past. And in that sense, we, as the global south or as the emerging and developing part of the world hemispheres, we have to ensure that our data, our participation in the digital economy does not fuel and does not underwrite and does not fund our subordination. I am worried that we are volunteering our own subordination. We are giving to the big platforms and the big technology companies everything they need to control and subdue and in many ways curtail our creative, economic and political freedoms. So this is a debate that must be had domestically in societies. It is not an international issue.
Thank you for your answer, Peter. You know, we're out of time. Time is up. So in brief, please.
So I agree that AI, that new technologies will create new hierarchies within societies and internationally. But one, I think, key difference with the old form of imperialism is where this power is going to play out. And I think this time, if you look at our technologists, the focus is not on real territory, but on cyberspace and outer space. Zuckerberg's metaverse and Musk's new colony on Mars. So there may be some kind of imperialism, but it will play out in virtual space and in outer space.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are to conclude, you know, these revision colonialism attempts will still exist. There is room for them. That's why there are countries, groups of countries, groupings, alliances, clubs, which strive not to subordinate to the attempts to get colonialism back. The world will be different, but it will have all the characteristic features of today's. Thank you so much for the discussion.